Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second annual Environmental Justice Seminar. This year, with the passing of Steve Wing, we're naming it the Steve Wing Environmental Justice Seminar Series. And before I forget, I want to thank Dr. Jim Merchant, who along with the Department of Epidemiology sponsors this seminar, and our intention in creating the seminar last year in a discussion with Steve is really to have a venue where we're bringing through at least once a year local or nationally recognized figure who's worked in environmental justice as a way that the students and the faculty and others across the school and across the campus and in the area would really be able to focus on and hear from experts in environmental justice who do a lot of different kinds of research. Last year, we were very happy to have Mr. Cody Wilson here for the first seminar. And in that spirit, we're continuing the excellence of the series. Very happy to welcome Chris Heaney, who many of you know from his time at UNC in the area. So, but I thought I would still do an introduction, an extensive introduction. Dr. Chris Heaney. So Chris is I guess he's got a 3 for UNC. He got his Bachelor's of Arts at UNC, his Master of Science in Environmental Sciences and Engineering in 2004, and his PhD from the Department of Epidemiology in 2008. He's had a postdoc position here as well, and in 2011 he has a faculty position in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University, and actually pleased to say, this is the big reveal, that he recently got promoted to associate professor. All right. And among his many roles at Hopkins, a couple to mention, is founding director of the Johns Hopkins Environmental Health, Microbiology, and Immunology Laboratory. He also has a joint appointment with the Department of Epidemiology at Johns Hopkins. And I think as you'll hear and see from his talk today, has wide-ranging interests. He really does really groundbreaking work at the intersection of infectious disease, environmental, and occupational epidemiologies, and taken on a number of important issues in antimicrobial resistance. He's one of the things that he was certainly involved in, still involved in, is looking at CAFOs and being heavily involved in community-based participatory research. So, after Chris has just done an incredible job of being an epidemiologist who's at the intersection of all these important areas, and certainly that, I'm sure he'll say, it reflects his training. You'll see his work with Steve Wing that inspired him and trained him up to work at the intersection of all these areas and work in the community. He is finally, on a personal note, it's not listed on the CV, but he's a heck of a mandolin player. That note.
Steve was multifaceted and multi-talented, and he was an incredible jazz piano player, as many people in our department know, and I'm just really glad to see people who knew Steve through music in the audience too, so that's great. So, all right, let me just take a deep breath because it's going to be hard to get through some stuff, but I'm just so honored to be here. Amy, thank you for inviting me. Just out of the outset is just thinking about kind of like why I'm even standing here is because of Steve and the role he played in my life. And some of the topics I'm going to talk about today, I can't claim to be even remotely expert in. Steve was a student of logic and probability and a lot of issues that he shared and imparted with me. And he had wide impact in community and academic settings. And I I was always amazed by Steve's abilities at translating in lay terms very important concepts, but going toe-to-toe in the most challenging academic settings too. So today, as kind of an outline, I just want to be upfront and say that I'm just going to try to impart some ideas and principles that Steve shared with me that I think are important, and they guided me when the school and the department is surveying master's students, and the missing course in the curriculum at Bloomberg was a course on environmental justice. And they had done a pretty good job of protecting my time to teaching classes for the first 3 years that I was there. And they said, the survey came back, anybody want to teach an environmental justice course? And it was like perfect timing. I said, well, I think I know how to do that. And it kind of fell into my lap. And at that point, I started talking with Steve and having conversations with him to kind of look behind the envelope, look behind the rationale for his course. And although students had called on him, Jacoby Wilson, Monserrat Tajik, and others who'd gone to the EJ network in Eastern North Carolina and heard all the community concerns of environmental justice, came back and asked Steve to start the course and handed him the walking points for a course. I think Steve made it his own, and I had the fortune to pick his brain about that. And so the first part of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the things I learned from Steve as a part of conversations when I was trying to prepare to replicate his course with his permission. And a lot of the themes are about who we as scientists serve, who our clients are, and taking a hard look at that in terms of thinking about a discussion of objectivity in science, and thinking about the clients we serve and the forces that lead to certain knowledge not coming out and being revealed, or concepts he talked about of obscuring truths, and how to overcome that. And Steve's whole idea was through careful thought and consideration and listening to what community has concerns about, we might be able to overcome some of those barriers, walking step by step with communities. And the idea is that in specific places and specific populations, there could be a way that a different mode of scientific methodology and research methodology could lead to knowledge discovery. And that's this idea of, I'm not newly bringing this, but it's just thinking about how can we continue the case for community-driven epidemiology to continue in the way that Steve was able to do it. And I'll talk a little bit about my work, as Heaney mentioned, with antimicrobial resistance and industrial animal production in Eastern North Carolina with Jill Stewart and many other people who have been critical on this. And then I really think if we all knew Steve, it was his self-criticism and also critical perspective in many ways that was so important for a lot of us. And I'll spend some time talking about principles that I thought of in terms of being self-critical and a concept of rationalization in terms of thinking about objectivity in science. So the clients we serve, who do we typically serve? We serve NIH, CDC, FDA, federal institutions that have priorities for knowledge discovery. We respond. We drive some of those priorities through our knowledge that we're advancing, but we're also responding to shifting tides and emerging epidemics like Zika. You know, that drives federal priorities and shifting funds around, which takes away from other areas. So Steve was always very aware of the fact that we are learning to respond to initiatives that are being driven by larger forces at a federal level down. And these clients are some of the federal institutions, but there may be entities that are shaping the priorities. And so his point, which I took away, is that this could perpetuate knowledge discovery in certain areas, but gaps in other areas. And there could be persistent gaps on certain topics in certain places or in certain populations. So that's one thing that he talked about. In the EJ class, and a lot of his science was about the question, why can community not be a client that we serve? Why is it not valid? Why is it any different? Why should it be considered any more or less biased if we're going to develop research questions that respond to community as a client? It's a complex question, I think, and it can be debated in many different ways. But I think that was a principle that Steve really stood behind in a lot of his work. The other principle, which we're not even getting to methodology yet in objectivity definition, is the idea of our alignments and conflicts of interest. And this question about should we as researchers work in partnership with community at all? And if particularly those communities or those organizations, whoever they are going to take an advocacy position. And how comfortable are we as scientists being close to or associated with in any way organizations that could be perceived as having an agenda of some kind. And even farther along, should we as scientists ever consider taking an advocacy position ourselves? And this is a tough one that I talked to Steve about a month before he passed, and I said, can you give me some shred of your perspective about why a junior scientist like me should consider taking a side, say, in CAFOs, in antimicrobial resistance? And he went back to tobacco. And he said, what if scientists had stood on the sidelines longer? Or what if scientists hadn't, in legal cases, volunteered to speak up about what they were seeing in associations with various pulmonary outcomes? That was an interesting approach and an interesting answer, but I still think we as scientists view advocacy as a four-letter word, and I think there are reasons for that, and they're important, but I think Steve walked a walk in terms of being able to do that in a way that his methodology could help defend him and some of the community interests. Another thing that Steve was just absolutely driving home with his students is this principle, this idea, we have to be more transparent. We have to be better at every single facet of research and be leading in order to avoid any external perception of darkness or hiding or obfuscation of relationships. And so he was always encouraging and coaching me how to be really clear about relationships with community partners in publications and other venues where there could be any financial or non-financial conflict of interest. So this was his principle of we should have real clear transparency about alignments and conflicts of interest. And some of the materials that Steve had shared with this, that he used in his class, this idea of that it's not new, it's a rented white coat. The idea that scientists are willing to, and there are shops like this, I think it's the Gradient consulting firm, which is a former Harvard School of Public Health professor who set up a consulting shop in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and essentially was ready for lawyers who were staying up all night on asbestos cases trying to figure out an alternative explanation other than asbestos exposure related to mesothelioma claims. And one of these examples in this article is, a lawyer coming up with a theory about there's a certain concentration of radiation in cigarette smoke, and it's the radionuclides in cigarettes that are explaining these claims of mesothelioma. And the rented white coats putting their name on papers supporting these theories. And a lot of clouds and darkness about these relationships. And it's not just going back into the history of an example like asbestos, but it's in the news now with Monsanto and the Roundup controversy in terms of its reclassification by IARC. And it's been revealed through discovery of emails and other documents that there appears to have been, there are claims of ghostwriting. Industry data, industry scientists and experts within the company crunching numbers and asking academics to put papers out into peer review and putting their name on it. So there's that side of examples that Steve would feed to me or push forward to talk about with his students, but I think we're in a pivotal place as scientists when we reverse it and think about if we're putting up examples of what not to do and how it's bad on the side of a theory that a lawyer comes up with on something that's, we might say, implausible, but it mucks up things that could delay claims and delay decisions for people for decades. Here's an example of a climate science type question about public perception. And this question of would it affect public opinion if they were given different talking points on a scale of advocacy that scientists are putting forward. And the conclusion is, and we can debate the methods of this paper, but I think it's an interesting concept, if we're starting to know as a scientific community with certitude about a topic like climate change, at what point are we doing our jobs and walking the walk if we're still not willing to take a position in terms of what we think is good or bad for public health? And so it's something I think about a lot, and I am still very careful in terms of advocacy positions that I take, and I try actually not to take them, and say that I could potentially be more effective in giving testimony right behind a 3-minute statement of a community partner where I speak on the data and on the facts and don't go beyond that. And so this gets to the idea that Steve talked about in his definition, which gets to maybe where if I go across the street to the Hopkins hospital, I'll never forget a conversation I had with some physicians who were talking about exposures through injection drug use and interventions that could avoid exposure to HCV and other infectious diseases. And a junior faculty had a really neat, clever idea about a new intervention and was going to pitch an observational study. And the Hopkins physician, senior person, said, you need to do an RCT because I won't believe your data until you randomize it. You need to do an RCT. So there's a methodological culture, where there's a culture that's saying objectivity is entirely through methodology. And I think Steve really pushed back at some of that by starting his students to think upstream from this. But clearly, there's a discussion, and faculty in this room are leading the field in terms of thinking about epidemiologic methods, and not just Steve thinking about the research questions that we choose and having community at the table, but the methodology going forward. What Steve really tried to drill home is where are we looking? And given that we can acknowledge that there's an inherent uncertainty in science and with any particular study, and knowledge that the opposition may be trying to cast doubt, sufficient doubt, to delay any action, he really drove home this idea of lamppost epidemiology, or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I love this Simpsons with Mr. Burns, where he's lit up the whole city with nuclear power and he's just basking under the lamp and light and just saying, isn't this one? I think he's singing a song. It's like a musical interlude here. And so some of the methodology that we use is appropriate to drive forward knowledge and discovery, but it's in the places that we're looking. And we can be very good at what we do. We can advance knowledge. But for me, what I spend a lot of time thinking about now in my career, and this transition I just went through 2 weeks ago with an associate professor, is the idea of rationalization. And I'll spend some time at the end thinking about that. And Vic did a great video series with Steve, and you had a nice quip. You said, you really are a critical, and you didn't finish. But he was critical, and he was a conscience of, I've heard some say, of the school in some ways, because of his level of critique. And it can be an impediment to moving forward, but I think there's a necessary, and Steve talked to me about having an ingredient for objectivity to work, to have a necessary level of criticism, both inward and outward. And it could if that breaks down, then the forces which could force that to break down are strong. The incentive structures for promotion and career advancement in science that we face, rewards and pressures that exist. So, I've been trying to build and do work that may continue some form of his work. And I have certain skills that are different from Steve's. He's contributed elegantly to starting with a cross-sectional design with a concern about growing industry of different shifts in producing hogs in North Carolina, and really through his papers and thinking about measurements and time. He used to say time is one of the most critical factors in epidemiology to think about. And I think he learned that through some of the reanalyses of data on the cancer outcomes that maybe hadn't been allowing sufficient time for the cancers to occur or for a different answer to emerge from 3 Mile Island and other situations. But with Cheo, it's this really landmark study, and he was so excited when he figured out that transient exposures were something the community was extremely concerned was the center of it, because the transiency of the exposures and doing relationships with biologically plausible transient outcomes, odor, health-related quality of life, acute exacerbations of respiratory symptoms, was this really elegant repeated measure study design, a panel design. And you could have each community member be her own control. So I was in undergrad, I think a senior, when he was starting Cheo, transitioning to a master's from anthropology as an undergrad into microbiology, a water laboratory. I don't have any of the skills that I see Steve really developing, and I'm trying to figure out how I can contribute. And all the while watching these really elegant series of discoveries come about. And it wasn't until I was finishing up my PhD and starting my postdoc that Steve, as a student, was always saying, hey, what are you learning about? What are you interested in? And it was always some microbiology topic. And Steve asked a million questions about microbiology. And I thought I knew a lot, and I thought I was getting really good training, but it was always in conversation with Steve where I realized I didn't know a lot about microbiology. He would ask those piercing questions where I'd be like, you know what, I don't know. And sometimes I take him up to the lab, to the walk-in incubator, to see some of the colifies grow. And that was just the kind of guy he was, to be